Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm Muriel and in this video I will be sharing the reading vlog I did for my mild spoilers largely failed attempt at reading the first 3 volumes in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series written by Stephen Erikson, and a summary review of the material I actually managed to read. First, a quick bit of background information. I first became aware of Malazan's existence years ago now, when I was gifted a copy of Gardens of the Moon by my brother. This was long before I got into online book spaces and amateur hobbyist reviewing, and thus long before I came to learn Malazan was considered one of the big fantasy series out there. Although, come to think of it, it might have been before Malazan was, in fact, considered as such, since I'm pretty sure I received Gardens of the Moon in my early teenage years, so most of the books in the series wouldn't even have been published yet at the time. Either way, I took a quick look at the book at the time, its list of characters, places, etc. Felt a little daunted. I was a less experienced SFF reader back then, after all, and I suppose not particularly interested by the blurb, and so I eventually donated it unread. And fast forward to a few years ago, when I heard about Malazan as a more fully fleshed out story, perhaps it wasn't quite finished yet though, and about the supposed quality of its theming and world building. I decided to put it on my maybe, but not quite a priority TBR, given it is a long series. Then along came my ex in 2021, who told me that, given my proclivities as an ideas or concepts-driven reader, I should definitely at least consider reading the first 3 books in the series. So I tried to do exactly that, and well, here's what happened. Hello everyone, and welcome at this attempt at a read-through of the first 3 books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, written by Stephen Erikson. Although I'm sad to say already that it will probably be a read-through of the first 2 books, because unfortunately this read-through is not going very well. I should have started the vlogging process a bit earlier as well. My bad there, because I'm already 1/3 of the way through Gardens of the Moon, and I'm struggling. Now, this is not the book's fault. I am kind of going through a pretty bad spell of burnout. This past week has been very bad on the mental health, CPTSD, fatigue front, but I'm a stubborn bitch. I decided to go ahead with my reading of Gardens of the Moon, but no, yeah, being burnt out like this is definitely not helping me connect with the text. Then I think it's just a function of the text itself. I'm just kind of bored. So I'm 1/3 of the way through. I've been introduced to one of the main plot lines with people in this Malazan Empire, which is decently reminiscent of the Roman Empire, because I'm pretty sure there's, at one point, a character drops a line about peace within the empire. The way it was phrased very strongly reminded me of the Pax Romana, so that's why it's making me think of the Roman Empire. So you've got an empire that are wizards, sorcerers, magic wielders. This empire went through a coup, so the previous emperor got bumped off, and a woman, a sorceress herself, rose to power and became empress. Her name is Lasine. I don't really care. Right this minute. You're given to understand that the empress wants to conquer the entire world, probably. I mean, it's an empire, it wants to expand, like all empires, right? And then you're introduced to a lot of different characters. There's like a dude named Perrin, who is a, I don't know, petty noble or merchant. It comes from a merchant noble family, went into the army. Because basically you have this prologue where you're shown that the old emperor got and then replaced by this new empress, and Perrin is a child in that prologue, and then you meet him again like 8-9 years later. You meet a group of elite soldiers called the Bridge Burners. They have a leader, and they also have magic wielders in that group.
you're introduced to a sorceress who's like 200 and something years old called Tattersail, and she's also a tarot. Well, I mean, it's not literally the tarot, but it's card magic system that is very reminiscent of the tarot. You also see a woman, an old woman who did necromancy with candles, and she's killed. I don't know, she jumps into the body of like a teenager, but then the teenage girl gets possessed by a god of shadows, and there's shadow hounds as well, so that happens. And then this girl joins the bridge burners, and they're all freaked out by this girl because they can feel there's something very wrong about her and uncanny. Well, yeah, she's possessed. The way I understood it, she's both possessed by the soul of an old witch and a god. Maybe I'm wrong about that though. And then you also meet a woman who's like a high-ranking officer in like the secret police, I think, of the Empress, and she talks to Perrin and sends him outside of this city called Pale to infiltrate the bridge burners because rumors perhaps of a coup against the Empress, because the bridge burners are friendly with another military officer, something called a Fist, and this High Fist dude, that's how I understood it, preferred the old emperor, so it's all rumors and you're not quite sure exactly what's going on. And then another high mage tried to kill them off, so there's like conflict within the army. Is the high mage working to put himself into power? Is he defending the empress? You're not really sure. And so you have this siege of the city called Pale, and there's a thing called Moon's Spawn. That was kind of cool, actually. Giant rock fortress thingy floating above it. It is populated by drow elves, is how I'm going to call them, because I mean, when you see the description of their leader called Anamanda Rake, it's a drow elf. Don't at me. I'm saying it like this. I don't mind, honestly, I don't mind, but I do think that part of the world building of Malazan started as a D&D campaign thingy, so that would make sense, but it's a drow elf is what it is, right? Or I mean, it's similar to that, but I don't mind. I mean, I'm being flippant about it, but I actually don't mind. It doesn't bother me. And so there's a siege, but during that siege, this high mage in the Malazan army has people, I mean, mages who are friendly with the bridge burners, has them basically killed. And then there's a book 2, so a second part where you're in this city called Darujistan, and this is still a free city, but the Malazan Empire wants to conquer the city and bring it into the fold of the empire, and so you have assassins and political intrigue in the city. And then okay, this is cool. There are magic giant ravens. The plot is very scattered, right? It's doing a lot of things immediately. There is no hand-holding, but I was prepared for this because I'd always heard this about Malazan. There is no explanation or like contextualization for anything that is happening. I wouldn't call it plotless, though. There is a kind of plot. It's basically a military campaign unfolding, or I mean, an imperialist expansion campaign with political intrigue, well, a bit of it within that, involving magic wielders. Oh, but then also, yeah, you have gods that are kind of doing shit in the background. There's like a trickster god and a shadow god. They fucked around with this dude named Perrin, who died, but then was resurrected and might be possessed by a god, I'm not sure. And then the Tisti, Andre, and I already forgot, the drow elves with the super OP magic user in the floating fortress. They might be buddies with elder gods, because there's newer gods, young gods, and elder gods. Okay, I'm interested in the theological world building, but so yeah, lots of different threads of plot running in parallel, and you have no idea how they're going to, I mean, I have a few ideas about how they're going to connect, but like, you're not told in the text. It is an approach to storytelling. Some people will hate it, some people will love it, some people won't mind it, or some people might like it in some contexts and not in others. I guess I'm one of those people. Right now, I don't really mind it so much in of itself. I'm just kind of bored. Nothing is really pulling me forward. But then again, I'm very burnt out, so that's not helping. I'm feeling a smidge of interest and excitement when I hear about those gods, the magic, though I've been given to understand that you won't really get to understand the magic system as it works in this series until further books, which might suck for me, because I really don't see myself reading, certainly not past book 3 for this initial read through of the series. But okay, but still, when they talk about the magic, I'm like, oh, with the Warrens, I'm like, okay, so these are pocket dimensions that channel magic energy linked to gods, maybe? So it's divine magic, juju stuff, I don't know. But that's where my mind is running, because I've read and watched so much fantasy and sci-fi now that I can imagine pretty much anything at this point. I mean, a lot of different scenarios, potential scenarios. Okay, so the war and magic thingy, there's that tarot card system, which is kind of nifty. There are magic giant ravens. Yes, I'm a Corvid fan. I see Corvids, I happy, so I'll give points for the Corvids. I mean, there's a giant female crow named Crone. Yeah, I like that. I'm a sucker for that shit. Okay, so I'll give a point for that. That giant flying bug mounts, the way that described, it kind of makes me think of a praying mantis. I'm like, yeah, why not? So those things kind of spark my interest, world building wise, theming wise. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's kind of a critiquing of Empire and War so far. I mean, it's very early stages. It's definitely not reading as grimdark so far, and I don't think it is technically grimdark, Malazan. I mean, as a whole, the writing's fine to good. I don't really have an issue with it. I do think the way those points of view are being presented, and like, again, personal preference thing, but I like multiple points of view stories. I like layered stories. I like complexity in storytelling and epic world building and stuff, but here I think it's a bit too much. I think it needed to be reined in somewhat, because that second part with the city-state of Darujistan, that's kind of ridiculous. It really is ridiculous, the extent to which you're just jumping from point of view to point of view without actually getting to know any character or much in terms of context. Again, I have a high tolerance for this stuff, but this is kind of stupidly overboard in a way. I'm like, that could have been edited down, smoothed over, whatever, so that's not great, honestly. And the thing is, I'm not super interested in any one thread of plot. The characters, it's fine so far, whatever, I just don't really care. And the fact is, so far, it reads as quite heavily military fantasy specifically, and that's just really not my thing at the outset. And like, you know, Song of Ice and Fire does a lot of theming around war, but it doesn't feel military-centric like this thing does so far, and I'm just kind of like, don't really care about following soldiers during a military campaign like this. I like more of the magic, or the theology, or the gods fucking shit up. It's fine. I am struggling though, because burnout is just making my patience for boredom, I guess, really harder. I mean, it's straining my patience. I'm doing a mixture of like text and audio because I want to be able to do other things while I listen to the book. But I mean, I've struggled to pick it back up already. This read through is already not looking good, which is why I might just read Gardens of the Moon and give Deadhouse Gates a shot, because apparently it's quite different from Gardens of the Moon, and Gardens of the Moon is acknowledged as not a great first book for the series, so if I just don't like it that much, I'll still give Deadhouse Gates a shot. But then if I'm just too tired with the series, or I mean the beginning of it, I might just not continue with book 3. And then I might try it again in the future, but right now, yeah, no, the burnout is just unfortunately fucking up my plans majorly. And then yeah, beyond that, I'm just not being gripped by the story so far. It's not bad, and the tantalizing bits of world building, maybe theming, but it's way too early to determine that. But the thing is, though, I'm already 200 plus pages into the book, and I'm like, very mixed feelings so far, sadly. I guess I'll check back in maybe when I hit the 50% mark, and if not the 50% mark, the 2/3 mark. Until then, happy reading! I am now apparently at the 69% mark in Gardens of the Moon, so just a bit past the 2/3 of this first book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. I am cautiously happy to report it's somewhat growing on me, just a smidge. I'm still kinda bored, and I'm not feeling the urge to keep reading as such, to pick the book back up, but as a reminder, I am still very much burnt out. But the book is a bit less tedious to go through, I guess. Not that it was tedious as such, but it's just slightly less boring. I'm not going to lie. Just full disclosure here. Crone, the giant, magic, old as fuck female Raven character, she is carrying the book for me right now. She the real MVP. I love her. I love her big, magical, floofy self. She's based as fuck character. Bestest character so far. She's carrying it. Now, I have been getting a bit more deep lore, a bit more background, theological world building, mythological world building. I'm all about that shit. And I'm like, okay, you're leaving tasty little crumbs for me to pick up like a raven. Or any kind of bird, really. So, no, that's interesting. The whole Tiste Andy, the Drow Elves, don't at me, and Anamander Rake, okay, and the Warrens of... Well, there's a Warren for Shadow and a Warren for Darkness. I kind of like that. You know what? I'll give a point for that. There's a distinction between Shadow and Darkness. Not the exact same thing, separate, distinct concepts. Half a point for that. There's a Warren of Light, and then you're getting information about the Elder or Eldering ring? No. That would be a contraction of Elden and ring, but no, okay, I'm just making a joke. The Elder Ring races? So the OG humanoids is how I'm understanding that, or the OG extra sentient civilizational races. So that stuff tends to pull me forward, right? As an ideas and concepts driven reader, give me that world building, that deep lore, and then, you know, suggestions of theming. I guess, and honestly, I had kind of read about this. I'm getting the suggestion that this series is going to go for big theming in terms of, like, what is civilization? What is the legacy of civilizations? The inherent flaws and vices and corruption within civilization. And if I remember correctly, I think Steven Erikson has a background in archaeology, or is it anthropology? I should check. I think it's archaeology, but then I think people who study archaeology do a bit of anthropology as well. Maybe he's just interested in that as well, to be fair. It doesn't have to be professional credentials in the slightest. But so I'm getting those vibes as well. I do think it's archaeology because there's a point where there are descriptions of how the soil layers up on monuments and old stone buildings and stuff. I'm like, archaeological writing, maybe? I don't even mind, to be clear, I don't mind it at all, actually. I'm kind of like, okay, I see you. I see what you're doing there. In terms of plot, it's finally kind of coming together. The different settings are joining up. The different plot lines and characters are kind of joining up. I would still argue it took too long. I would still maintain that this whole hopping of point of view to point of view was done in a way that was a bit roughshod, at least in the first third of the book. That really could have been polished. Again, I don't ever really believe in absolute objectivity with these things, but that to me is something that really could have objectively been improved for this first book. Darujistan, the city-state, is still standing for now. There was some kind of epic battle. Well, it was more of an assassin. It's not really a battle, but it was very action-heavy sequence on the rooftops of Darujistan with different factions coming together and trying not to die. And now this, I think, much more important plot element has been introduced, which I'm guessing is going to be important for further books as well in the series as a whole. This tyrant of an ancient race of humanoids, or civilization N race species. This tyrant who was a mage, enslaved people and beings and living creatures for 3,000 years. God Emperor of Dune, anyone? No. This being has been entombed in a magical coma or something. I'm getting the idea that this thing is not fully dead, but then there seems to be more of a suggestion in this universe. I mean, people do die, but then they can be resurrected because magic and gods intervening and things. Lysine wants to resurrect this Chagut tyrant to take out Anamander Rake is how I understood that. But even her adjunct is like, yo, that's not a good idea. What the fuck you been smoking, bitch? I mean, that's the vibe. Because it seems like a very bad idea, very dangerous. And it's like, no, we don't want to do that. The stakes are being raised. And I like this. I like the deeper lore I'm getting. I do have this issue with how it's being executed, though. Because the plot took a minute to find its footing and get going, and then kind of link up all the disparate elements. And now we're going for this really epic scope. This huge scope of, like, this thing could be enslaving an entire continent, and maybe more. And I mean, fair enough, the Malazan Empire wants to conquer the world, but that feels more grounded in reality. It's fantasy, right? It shouldn't matter, but the best fantasy always has elements of realism, in my opinion. That felt more like, okay, the Roman Empire. And I mean, the Roman Empire never conquered the world, but it conquered a big chunk of the world as its people knew it, right? Like the Mediterranean basin and into Europe and etc. But that feels more grounded in reality. Okay, it's a human empire conquering continents with armies on the ground and mages, of course, but still. And now we're talking about a thing that's like a god king, a god emperor wants to enslave everything around it. It feels like the shift from the more grounded aspect of the plot to this more mythic aspect, the shift itself feels a bit rough. It feels like the setup, there's like a step missing, basically. You know, like a set of stairs, and there's a certain progression to the stairs, but then there's like a step missing, and so I kind of tripped onto the next stage of the stairs. That's my feeling. It's not terrible. I've seen worse in terms of plot progression roughness, but it could have been smoother too. So not the greatest transition, not the worst. I kind of started to like Tatasale, and Tatasale gets killed, but not really, because very immediate kind of reincarnation magic. Why not? So we'll see what happens with that, but I kind of liked her. I find her, I don't know, maybe not necessarily relatable, because that's just always very rare for me, but she feels very rounded as a person. She's done very bad things, she regrets them, she has a lot of compassion. No, this is definitely also, I want to add this, not grimdark so far. There's a lot of emphasis on maybe, you know, not valuing sociopathy for the sake of it, or nihilism as such. It's human beings with human conflicts. There is compassion shown by some characters, a valuing of friendship, not, you know, going for rah-rah mindless genocide and massacre. Maybe we don't want to do that, actually, even if people are pro their empire and pro loyalty to their rulers. They're like, can we maybe not genocide? Just throwing that out there. So, okay, there is some of that. So it's definitely not grimdark. But again, I didn't really think that Malazan would be grimdark in any case, but now it's really confirmed for me in my mind. It's just dark fantasy, but Song of Ice and Fire is dark fantasy. It's more in that general tonal range, I guess. Tonal moral range. And that's about what I have to report. So it's getting better. Am I fully on board with the series so far that I will just go on and read all 10 books? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I will definitely finish Gardens of the Moon, and I will most definitely read Deadhouse Gates. Because at this point, my reading schedule has been fucked thoroughly. So that's that, because yay, burnout. So at this point, what I can say is that if by the time I finish Deadhouse Gates, I like it enough, I think what I'll do is just continue the series over a slower period of time, which is probably not the greatest idea either, because memory is not always reliable, and I don't want to drag it out for too long either, because I don't think that would be the best reading experience. But there are other things I want to read, and I need to be better about maybe not necessarily mood reading, but just impulse, pure pleasure reading. If I want to keep reading for one thing, not that I'll ever stop reading because it's just one of my core things. But also, if I want to keep reviewing books and take pleasure in reviewing books and discussing books and their themes, etc., I need to find a better system going forward in any case. So maybe I'd read 2-3 books a year, depending on the other things I read, but I also need to get good at DNFing. Anyway, that's where I'm at with all this and with Malazan. For now, I will probably check in again for Gardens of the Moon when I finish it, and then with Deadhouse Gates, I think I'll just either check in every 20% mark or every 25%. We'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens in the book if it warrants just me adding in thoughts. So, until then, happy reading. So, yeah, I did it. I finished Gardens of the Moon. I finished it last evening, and what can I add? My overall impression is that it was fine. Slightly above average, but not fully good for me. Very, very flawed. Just about good enough that, yeah, I'm going to read Deadhouse Gates, but I don't feel so good about reading the entire series based just on Gardens of the Moon. Not at all. First off, something that my bestest bookish friend made me aware of, it was a very good point on her part, and I was like, oh yeah, actually. So every chapter, every part of Gardens of the Moon, and then every chapter within said parts are prefaced by an epigraph. I'm usually a big fan of epigraphs, if they serve an actual purpose. Oftentimes, I found that I love epigraphs that serve a world-building function. You have this in Dune, you have this in The Left Hand of Darkness, you have this in The Ninth Reign as well. The problem is that in Gone to the Moon, those epigraphs are kind of wasted. I didn't really get the point of them beyond mere aesthetics kind of vibes, because most of the epigraphs are either poems or songs, pieces of ballads. They don't actually really give you much world-building information or broader context for what's happening in the story, and so they feel kind of misused. Well, more than kind of, they just feel misused and wasted. Most of them, there may be like one or two that kind of give you a bit of information, actual information, but most of them are just too obtuse, self-referential, or just referring to the story before you're actually familiar with it, or referring to the world before you're actually significantly familiar with it. So it's kind of like, what is the purpose of these epigraphs? I guess it's kind of neat if you reread the series, and then you can kind of pick up on what they're actually referencing, talking about. For people who enjoy the series and reread the books and can enjoy them fully, good for you, but like, for new readers, I just very much wasted potential there with those epigraphs. And then with regards to character work, I just wanted to add that I don't think the character work is particularly good. It's not particularly bad either. It's serviceable. One thing I did notice, though, is particularly with regards to character motivations, those, in some instances, are very poorly set up, and again, shifted through very roughly. The main example of this for me was Perrin. For me, the way his motivations changed throughout the series just doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm kind of like, why? Why is he changing his mind about this? Like, why is he... Like, one minute he's feeling something about X, the other minute, or like a few pages later, it's like, nah, I did a 180, and I hate the Empire, or I hate this person. It's like, but why though? There's a lot of... is this a question of telling, not showing? Maybe, kind of. Partly at least. I'm just like, there was no proper build-up setup for the character and their motivations and their changing of motivations, more importantly, and I was like, no, that was not well done. Quick little addendum here, because I realized I forgot to say this. I do realize that Perrin is, for a part of the story at least, possessed or under the control of the twin gods of fate, chance, luck, whatever you want to call it, Opon, so that probably impacts the way he acts and thinks, but even still, taking that into account, I still think it wasn't set up very well, his motivations and his changing of motivations. And I understand that a fair few characters are under the influence of gods or ascendants, what have you, but I think that can be true, and my issues with how it was executed be valid at the same time. I don't think those are two mutually exclusive things. Also, very minor quibble, but the whole Perrin seems very attached to and concerned for Tatasale. It reeked a bit of insta-love, maybe not even insta, but insta-liking to a degree that I just did not find convincing in the slightest. Because, like, he saves her life, they fuck. Again, I'm demisexual, I don't get that, but fine, it's a part of the human experience. Okay, they have sex. But then it's like, oh no, I mean, sure, I'm not saying you can't have some basic human empathy for an acquaintance, but it's built up as if he just has this very deep, genuine caring for her. And again, it's based on absolutely nothing in the text, and I'm like, yikes. It wasn't offensive, because at this point I've seen it so many times that it wasn't a central point of the story. It was just, I don't know, it's just so silly to me. Another very minor quibble that kind of has to do with world building, sort of. The naming conventions in the book, nothing bothers me too much. I don't feel there's an overarching pattern to the naming of things or to any kind of legit linguistic world building as of yet. Big exception to this though. I kind of low-key hate the name Darujistan for that city, for a very specific reason. Again, it is a minor quibble, yes, but I is nitpicky bitchworm. That's just how I am. On planet Earth, you have a few different countries that have this stan suffix to them, and that's usually because there's a shared history somewhat with regards to culture, or at the very least linguistics, and they tend to, you know, cluster around a specific geographical region. So when I see a city with that suffix stan, it kind of just, it stuck out to me like a sore thumb. I was like, this feels wrong, especially since it's like the only city you learn of that has that kind of name. It was just kind of bugging me a little bit. It was just bugging my brain. I'm like, why did you call it that, Darujistan? And it's like the only city-state that has that kind of name, given, you know, the history of those place names on Earth. And I was just, really, can you have just called it Daru or Daruji? Even Daruji would have been so much better. I don't know. It's just really bugging. It's a tiny thing, but it's not so tiny given the importance of that city-state in the story. So I was kind of like, meh. I would not have gone with that kind of name, but your mileage will vary there, obviously. And so, yeah, I'm still kind of meh on the story so far. It was warming up to it, but then I have to say the ending of Gardens of the Moon is a bit of a mess. The action just ramped up to 11, and so many different things were happening at once again, and then it introduces new elements kind of out of the blue, and you're kind of like, what the fuck is that? And then at some point, again, fine, I was tired, I'm still burnt out, I've had some absolutely abysmal couple of days, but even still, I'm like, what? And I was reading the text, I wasn't even doing the audiobook, and I was like, what is happening? What? Did I get this correctly? And I was like, did it really need to be written this way? I guess it's fine to introduce a concept which will then be explained in a further book, but I don't know, just the execution of it felt messy to me. That's my overarching impression. That ending was very, very messy. Not a fan. And then linked to this, I don't necessarily think it's bad as such. I'm just not sure I'm a fan of it personally, taste-wise. The RPG origins of, at the very least, Gardens of the Moon are very apparent if you know what to look for. I know it originated in tabletop RPG gaming, Dungeons and Dragons, I believe. Now, I'm not really experienced with tabletop RPGs. I am with video game RPGs, though, and I'm kind of like, this shit is very noticeable if you know what to look for. I don't know, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't know that I necessarily like that in my literature. It's kind of like what I said when I read the Book of the New Sun. It's been compared to Dark Souls and company, and I'm like, well, sure, and I love Dark Souls, but I might not necessarily want the same kind of storytelling which I find works in a video game like Dark Souls in a work of fiction literature. And so I think this is kind of happening again here. It's especially flagrant with the combat sequences, especially not necessarily battles, but duels, where you just have these kind of ridiculously overpowered entities, godlike or actual gods. This also seems to be a running, maybe not theme as such, but motif in the story, and from what I've read already in the series, just humans, regular mortal beings can become gods. And like lower gods are ascendants, or they're called ascendants, which suggest ascendancy, apotheosis. Okay, fine, whatever, why not? Why not? So yeah, you have gods, godlike beings. Like, I'm sorry, but when I read a scene with Anamander Rake, a fucking 7 feet tall dude, looks like a drow elf, edgelord who can turn into a black dragon, okay, cool point. There's a cool factor, yes, but bruv has a giant ass, like a gut sword, basically, right? And then in front of him is like a demon lord with like a giant freaking battle axe. I'm sorry, but I'm not thinking great work of deep, meaningful, fancy literature when I read this. I think, oh, Dark Souls boss battle. Which, again, I fucking love Soulsborne games. I adore those games, but I'm not sure that works for me in a novel, even in an epic fantasy one. And I don't know, I'm not sure I vibe with that exactly. Or I mean, I was also reminded of Final Fantasy 16, because it's just a bit like spectacle for the sake of spectacle, which again, this is a personal preference thing. I'm not sure I'm a fan of that. Here again, a very quick little addendum. I should add that on its own, I probably wouldn't mind as much if there was just an adequate, once again, amount of setup for it. My issue with this, like, overpowered bosses in an RPG vibe is also tied to the fact I feel like there's a very rough escalation of stakes and power scaling, I guess. I mean, ironically and funnily enough, that is actually kind of like a Soulsborne game, you know, with that very steep learning and difficulty curve. But I just really don't think it works that well in a work of fiction literature. Or, I mean, it doesn't work that well for me. It's like that, you know, set of stairs metaphor I used previously. There's just a couple steps missing for me in the progression from more grounded stakes to these epic, godlike beings smiting each other with magic swords and battle axes, rah 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 vibe, which again, yeah, it's fine for Final Fantasy 16 and Dark Souls, and even then there are better ways of doing it and worse ways of doing it. But yeah, no, it just does not work for me here. There's a lot of setup missing for it to work at least a bit more for me, if that makes sense. And I'm very surprised in a way, given the way these books are talked about is like, oh, this is how you get your PhD in fantasy literature, and I'm like, really? When I'm being reminded of Final Fantasy 16? Really? I don't know about that, but, you know, to each their own. So yeah, and that's also why I'm kind of like, is it the most original thing in fantasy? No, I don't think it needs to be. The obsession with, like, pure originality, I think, is very silly. I'm not really about that. I'm kind of like, yeah, maybe if you've only read Tolkien-esque fantasy, maybe, but I'm like, if you're at all familiar with fantasy in other mediums, or media. No, I've seen this stuff before. RPGs, JRPGs. Oh yeah, this is very familiar, but again, I'm not sure I like it in literature as such. And so yes, I have kind of looked ahead a tiny bit to what's in store for me in terms of these books. It's not looking good. From the critiques I've seen about the series, this is not going to be my cup of tea, and it's not going to give me the kind of thematic depth I enjoy in epic fantasy, or can enjoy in my favorite works of epic fantasy. I don't even think it might necessarily deliver in terms of world-building depth. But hey, I don't know. I'm gonna give Deadhouse Gates a try, and then if I don't like it enough, I might just read up on the lore, because I kind of like the lore. Well, at least some of the bits of it I've seen, so I might just read up on it through wikis, because I tend to do that for fun. But in terms of the actual storytelling, yeah, no, I'll give book 2 a try. No guarantees after that, and so I think I'll do every 25%. Yeah, let's go with that. So, see you next time in Deadhouse Gates. Until then, happy reading! Hello again, everyone. So, I am checking in to report on my reading experience of Deadhouse Gates, and I'm very sorry to say I'm calling it quits. I'm struggling with my mental health at the minute. It is affecting my ability to just kind of power through books, which I just don't find particularly interesting or engaging, but I would otherwise trudge through because I usually can't DNF. So, I mean, my tolerance for just boredom and disinterest for the sake of potentially getting some payoff, my tolerance has been annihilated by burnout and CPTSD linked stuff. So it just doesn't make sense for me to continue forcing myself to read Malazan and just pick up the audiobook or pick up the book and spend hours reading it and then feeling like, oh, I have to get back to it. I have to down 100 pages today. It's a chore. And reading should never be a chore. I'm an idiot for not DNFing more often, right? So I have to get good. I have to get good at DNFing. It starts here and now with Malazan. Now with Deadhouse Gate specifically, why was that my breaking point? So I'm DNFing at 35% in. I think I gave it a fair shot. I don't hate it. This is not a situation where I'm like, oh, I'm absolutely loathing what I'm reading. I'm just thoroughly disinterested. I don't care about anything or anyone in the actual story. I still find bits of the world building, the lore, interesting and engaging, but the way that is being fed to me and delivered in the actual story of Here Deadhouse Gates, it's not enough. It's not enough for me to keep going. I am an ideas and concepts driven reader, but here, what concepts and ideas there are just not pulling me forward. So if that's not pulling me forward as an ideas and concepts driven reader, then I at least need plot, a super engaging plot, or, I mean, I'm not a character driven reader in any case, but even the characters I kind of don't fully care. I don't hate them either, but the plot has to pull me forward, and the plot is not pulling me forward either. So there's a certain point I'm like, I have to pack it in. It's a shame because, like I said, I actually kind of somewhat like bits of the world building. It's the kind of story I think would just work better for me in another medium. Maybe mild hot take here, I think Malazan would work 1,000 times better as an actual RPG. For me.
as an actual video game, like an Elder Scrolls type RPG. I mean, I said before regarding Gardens of the Moon, the RPG origins of Malazan are pretty obvious if you know what to look for. Well, here I'm contending it would actually work better as just a straight up RPG. If the authors, so Mr. Esselmont and Mr. Erickson, and with or without the fandom, if they were to put like a lore book, you know, kind of like A World of Ice and Fire, I wouldn't mind just picking that up and kind of reading through it just for fun, because I've done this through wikis for other stories. So I'd do that. I'd even pick up a graphic novel adaptation of Malazan. But as a series of novels, it's just not working for me. The story by and large was still also just kind of too militaristic for my taste. I'm not a fan of the desert setting, if I'm being perfectly honest. I think I kind of agree with the fandom that Deadhouse Gates is better than Gardens of the Moon in terms of writing, but not that much either, though. For me, I'm sorry, but the jumping quality is not immense. It's not even that big. A little bit, but not significantly, and certainly not enough for me to keep plodding along. There's a bit more like drive and focus in the storytelling, but again, you start with 5 different plot lines with completely new characters, and it takes a while to get going for you to get a footing on what exactly is happening. Is it impossible to do? Absolutely not. I don't think it's nearly as complicated as some people make it out to be either. Like, I can still follow and understand what's happening, but there's a tediousness to it that, again, right now I just have zero tolerance for. And with the characters, I found Felicen kind of interesting, and the Trell and Jag characters vaguely, but again, it's kind of like, why are they here? What are they doing? Why do I care? All to just get bits of background lore? It's just not enough. It's not enough to keep me going. It just isn't. And I will probably come back to this in my condensed summary review. I'll append to this reading vlog. But I have seen some Malazan fans. I've seen a lot of lovely Malazan fans online. They're not all, because the Malazan fandom has a certain reputation. I have seen examples justifying that reputation, but I've also seen a lot of perfectly civil, nice people just kind of talking about Malazan and being like, no, I totally get why some people don't like this, is, you know, to each their own. That's all fine. I have seen some people being like, you shouldn't approach Malazan like a regular novel, you should approach it as like history, and I'm like, no offense to the person who said that. If that's why they love Malazan, more power to them. I find that comment pretentious as fuck, and I hate it, because I'm sorry, Malazan the Book of the Fallen is a series of novels. Okay, Gardens of the Moon is a novel, Deadhouse Gates is a novel. It's not, this is not the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Fuck off. Okay, stop it. This is why the Malazan fandom has the reputation it has. Stop doing that. No, these are still very much novels. Okay, the fictional stories. I'm not saying it doesn't try and maybe achieve, at least for some readers, some kind of grand theming on civilization and the unfolding of history. Sure, and plenty of fiction does have the greatest stories, have big themes, or deep themes, or just well-developed themes. It doesn't always have to be huge civilizational themes. It can be very intimate, human-centric, or human emotion-centric themes. But yes, the best literature has great theming. Yes, so I'm not saying Malazan has shit theming. I did not read the series, and I will probably never read the series. You love it, you think it has great themes, I'm so happy for you, but don't say stuff like, it's not actual literature, it's history. Fuck off. Respectfully fuck off, because no. That being said, I think this is kind of part of the issue. There's an issue of narrative distance for me with Malazan, I noticed. Or again, the bits of it I've read. I feel like it is, in fact, trying to go, perhaps, this is how I read it, that kind of like Silmarillion, Fire and Blood, fake history approach to storytelling, or to background lore for another main story, because again, the Silmarillion is my favorite legendary book, and I'm unusual for that. I'm a weirdo for this, right? This is not common, I don't think, at all. And Fire and Blood is very much additional lore for Song of Ice and Fire nerds. I mean, I think it's still well written and it's enjoyable as fiction. But the point is, those books, they're doing something specific in a specific way. And I think part of the issue with the bits I read of Malazan was that I felt it was both trying to do that, but then also work as just a traditional story, like The Lord of the Rings, if we're taking the Legendarium example again, or A Song of Ice and Fire for that story and series. But by trying to do both, again, I'm not saying, again, remember, I don't really give a shit about authorial intent. So the story, by trying to do that, that's what I perceived, it's actually failing to do both. It's like the worst of both worlds for me. So this kind of like narrative distance is exactly the wrong distance for me to enjoy the story and keep going through it. And also because I don't really care about the plot, the theming, the crumbs of theming, such as I pick them up, not enough for me, or not good enough, which is not my kind of theming, and the lore, again, not enough of it, and not delivered in a way that works for my brain for me to keep going with this series. It just wasn't meant to be. It's just not for me. That's the conclusion. It's just not meant for me, and that's fine. It is, has been, and will be for lots of other readers. I'm so happy for them. Like I said, I'll add a couple little just positives, negatives overall of my experience with this not even first fifth of the series. But alas, it is what it is. Still, thanks for sticking with me for this aborted read-through of the beginning of the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, written by Steven Erikson. And until the next time, hope you're all doing well, and happy reading.
Now on to my summary review of, to be crystal clear here, the Malazan material I actually read. So, all of Gardens of the Moon, Book 1, and a little over a third of Deadhouse Gates, Book 2. So all in all, a little less than 3/20 of Malazan, Book of the Fallen. I am not reviewing the entire series as a completed work of fantasy literature, since I have not read it, nor will I be making any definitive statement on its, always subjective, mind you, quality or lack thereof, as a completed work of literature, for myself or anyone else. Okay, so let's start with the prose. I don't have anything too specific to report here. I found Mr. Erikson's prose decent to good overall. It did the job, felt eloquent or even somewhat inspired at times. I did write a couple of quotes down here and there in my reading log. End of story, basically. I know some people think it's really bad, some find it's quite good. I guess I'm somewhere in the middle, and as a reminder, I will freely admit I am, in any case, pretty shite at analyzing or even just describing the finer aspects of prose, because I lack the technical skills and vocabulary to do so. Prose is also not at the top of my hierarchy of literary needs, so that's that. I did have an issue with the pacing of Gardens of the Moon, as I generally do when stories coast along at a rather leisurely pace, only to go balls to the wall wild with action in their final sections. I'm not saying that never works for me, but it seems it's just not my preference, especially with stories that don't really do it for me on other fronts. Both Gardens of the Moon and Deadhouse Gates tended to have chapters on the longer side of things, which I wasn't a big fan of either, especially, once again, since I wasn't particularly invested in their plots in any case. Every chapter also featured several different points of view, a narrative choice I normally like, but here, the transitions between them weren't always the smoothest, unfortunately. The character work, such as it was in the pages I read, again, was fine overall. It was decent to good in a couple of instances, and alright to kind of bad in some others. Perrin, for instance, did not make sense to me in terms of character motivations, or rather the shifting thereof, and no, I didn't find the "but mayhaps godly manipulations" excuse good enough. Another character just up and changed her mind about something that had been established as pretty fundamental to her identity and worldview before she died, and I just couldn't quite buy it. Then again, when you have so many different characters right out of the gate, and all vying for precious screen time in every single chapter, it isn't so surprising that you wouldn't devote enough time to properly fleshing all of them out. Especially if you also have to introduce and juggle, let's say 10, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean, 10 different world-building elements. I'll come back to this too many things too soon issue in a few minutes. I'm not a character-driven reader, no, but the fact I didn't really care about any character, okay, I kind of like one of the female characters in Deadhouse Gates, and I've already forgotten her name, yay, nor even find most of them particularly interesting at the outset, except for that character, so that didn't help, although I did like Tatasail. Outside of the insta-levy shtick with Perrin, and Crone, the old as fuck magical raven in Gardens of the Moon. She was based. Yes, it seems my favorite Malazan character was a bird. Make of that what you will. Either way, hashtag she was the real MVP. A point of firmer criticism that mildly overlaps with world building. The fact this story, or again, the bits of it I read, features old, and I mean extremely old, think ancient beings, some of them godlike, with speaking roles, actually broke my immersion a little. Convincingly portraying non-human animal minds is difficult to pull off. Portraying alien, eldritch, or godlike minds is extremely difficult to pull off. It can be done, but holy shit is it rare in my limited experience. It's all the harder to do when you have them sit down for a fireside chat, a cup of tea, and fucking speak like what essentially amounts to a slightly odd or aloof human being. And I'm sorry, but it just did not work for me with Anamanda Rake, or the orcish characters in Deadhouse Gates. They're not orcs literally, but they kind of look like orcs. Anyway, with the former especially, you're telling me this bruv is 300,000 years old, or 100,000 years old? Very old. Nah, I don't buy it. I just didn't buy it, not for 1 second. That kind of character, in my opinion, should be spoken of, observed by others, not spoken to. Sue me. I honestly didn't read enough of the greater story to have any strong opinions regarding the series' overarching theming. What threads or crumbs I picked up here and there seemed to be concerned with the rise and fall of empires, and civilization, its nature, its pitfalls, etc. Okay. The nature of power or godhood or apotheosis in a rather JRPG reminiscent sense, but I'll come back to that, might have also been bopping about in there. None of these crumbs were bad as such, but what I managed to gather on my reading plate didn't particularly engage or appeal to me, given my personal theming preferences or the way these were peppered throughout the pages I read. Perhaps it would, or eventually amount to something I could in fact appreciate to some extent, but A, I do know myself as a reader at this point, so doubt. And B, life's too short and there are too many other books out there to justify expending this much effort to get to something my brain could only potentially vibe with in these ones. I didn't hate what bits of world building I got in the bits of Malazan I read. In fact, those are the bits I liked the most by far. The problem is, I didn't get enough of them, or get them in a sufficiently fleshed out way, to compensate for my utter lack of interest in the broader story, and what I got wasn't delivered in a way that really worked for me. What I read of Malazan, in my opinion, suffered from conflating complexity with depth, and from conflating quantity with quality. It's basically a version of the too many things, too soon problem in my book. I am not, to be crystal clear, saying there is no depth at all to the world building, but from the little research I've done into the series, because I wanted to understand things a bit more, so I consulted wikis and such, it does seem like there won't be as much depth of information and immersion in this series as I'd like, as I'd need for this series to become a new favorite, or to simply once again justify expending additional effort to continue reading it. Not enough depth, and not the kind that would just work for me, also to be extra clear. This series certainly feels ambitious, yes, at the outset, but in terms of executing said ambition, well, let's just say that sometimes narrowing your scope, your arsenal of world-building elements, if you will, in the beginning, to strengthen your foundations, just might be a better approach. In my humble and, of course, entirely subjective opinion, as always. Still, on the positive side of things, I found the magic intriguing, though not mind-blowingly fascinating either. The sketches I got of theological and mythological world-building were decently compelling as well, though not when it came to things involving combat. I'll come back to that in a minute. The Tiste Andi did have that cool factor to them, but they also just screamed drow elves to my visual brain. Here again, I'll come back to that in a minute. There were giant bug mounts, neat, and a book or series always gets a point from me for having solid Corvid representation. The shamanic, Neanderthal-esque undead dudes, I've forgotten their names, it's fine, were kinda neat as well. But that brings me to another issue, the temporal scope of this story. It is huge. That's not intrinsically a problem, but it kind of breaks for me when expressed through actual living characters who are either absurdly old in an unconvincing fashion, or who seem to have an awareness and understanding of the past that strains credibility, to some extent at least. I guess, were I to play devil's advocate, if you can talk to creatures, beings that were bopping about 50k years ago, that would in fact help with fleshing out your history books, but then conversely, Deadhouse Gates had a thousands of years old, I think, character who seemed to be weirdly ignorant of the history of his own homeland or native continent. Talk about being sheltered there, I guess. Maybe this stuff gets smoothed over in the rest of the series, but as it stood in the first book and the third, I didn't think it worked too well overall. I also said in the vlog that I had an issue with the narrative distance in Malazan. It felt like it was trying to go both for a mythical or actual fictional history vibe a la Silmarillion or Fire and Blood, and a more intimate, immediate, character-focused story vibe a la Lord of the Rings or the main series of A Song of Ice and Fire. And for me, it failed to satisfyingly reach either. Not that it was a huge issue, but I didn't find the story's linguistic world-building particularly good. It wasn't terrible by any means, but there's nothing for it. I'm still bugged by that one singular city-state named Darojistan. And as a friend pointed out to me, a weirdly high number of characters in both Gardens of the Moon and Deadhouse Gates had janky object names for some reason, or like adjectives for names. I don't know, it's just weird. I'll also reiterate that I found the book's epigraphs majorly wasted in terms of world-building potential. They were just way too opaque and self-referential for first-time readers. And finally, an additional small thing I noticed. There was a rather strange dissonance between the stated to be more or less sex-egalitarian world of Malazan, or parts of it at least, and the still kind of gendered perceptions of a lot of its characters, especially when it came to lustful observations. Something just didn't quite add up for me there, given my understanding of things like patriarchy, gender, feminist theory, etc. I'm sure this will not bother most readers, and I want to be clear, this isn't something I found offensive or problematic, just more so something that I felt didn't really make sense from a greater world-building perspective. And yes, I'm aware Mr. Erickson has stated he purposely wanted to create a sex-egalitarian, non-patriarchal by default fantasy world, and I can respect and appreciate that intent, and that the reasoning provided for said sex equality in-world, or parts of it, is that anyone can potentially become a magic user, and powerful. The issue I have with that, beyond the fact authorial intent kind of means jack shit to me if I can't actually perceive it in the text, is that the whole men oppress women because of raw physical strength, power argument just betrays a somewhat limited understanding of sex-based oppression and patriarchal societal systems. Again, as illustrated in this specific work of fantasy literature, to be crystal clear, I cannot and won't speculate further on what Mr. Erickson personally knows or doesn't know about broader feminist theory because I don't know the man. And yes, I know some people find Malazan Book of the Fallen to be a feminist series, but I would very respectfully but strongly disagree with that claim when it comes, once again, to the bits of it I read, given what I just said about that strange, let's call it conceptual dissonance. I will say though, it was nice to notice an absence of sexual violence in book 1, although I know for a fact that very much does not apply to the rest of the series, so, well. A few additional thoughts. Like I said in the vlog, I'm not really into military fantasy or science fiction in general, and what I read of Malazan was pretty military-centric, so that was meh for me. Conversely, I was glad to see Malazan didn't read as grimdark fantasy, though I don't think Malazan is classified as grimdark fantasy in any case. Yes, Malazan does that whole in media res thing, and it doesn't hold the reader's hand when it comes to explaining its plot stakes or world. In fact, a lot of new readers are encouraged to listen to, say, a podcast, or consult an online PowerPoint recapping every single chapter of the series, is also interesting, shall we say? I don't think that should be considered normal, or even desirable when getting into a work of literature for the first time, in the slightest, but I'll leave it at that. What I read was a little confusing at times, yes, but that's mostly because of the way the story and points of view was structured and paced. Not so much because you need a Rick and Morty size IQ to get it. It's not easy reading, I guess, but it is still perfectly understandable and not nearly as hard as some people make it out to be, which also means that no, I don't think reading this series gets you a symbolic PhD in fantasy literature or whatever nonsense some Malazan fanbros spout on the internet. Yes, I have seen examples that illustrate why the Malazan fandom has the reputation it does. That being said, hashtag absolutely not all Malazan fans, as I've also seen plenty of comments written by perfectly nice and reasonable fans of the series, so it's all good. And yes, once again, there is nothing for it. The RPG origins of and influences on Malazan Book of the Fallen were very obvious to me past a certain point. When I got to that duel between Anamanda Rake and that demon prince creature thing being, whatever, I didn't feel the epicness. I laughed because it felt like reading a Dark Souls boss encounter, and whilst that shit is epic feeling when you play it, it somehow just does not work for me in a novel format. Some things work in video games that do not work in literature, that's just my conclusion. I was also reminded of Final Fantasy XVI and the Elder Scrolls, which is why I maintain this story would work 1,000 times better for my brain as an actual RPG. Or perhaps a graphic novel. Sure, why not? Ultimately, I just found myself thoroughly uninterested in the story's plot, characters, and not engaged enough by its world building or bits of theming. Malazan, or rather the bits of it I tried and read, bounced right off of me and rose no higher than a 6 to a soft 6.5 out of 10, so principally for Gardens of the Moon. The vibratory harmonization between text and brain that makes the story click for me never occurred, and I must thus, alas, DNF the series. At the risk of repeating myself though, that does not mean I think this series is objectively bad or garbage, what have you, and I don't even really believe in that concept, you know, objective goodness or badness for this stuff in any case, or that no one else should give it a go if it sounds like that kind of thing. I personally wouldn't specifically recommend it to readers who I know for a fact read things in a way similar to me, because duh, but that's pretty much the extent of it with regards to that. And that will be all for this reading vlog and summary review of, well, Gardens of the Moon and a bit of Deadhouse Gates. Basically, my failed attempt at reading the first 3 volumes in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series written by Stephen Erickson. Nonetheless, I hope you found this video interesting, engaging, entertaining, all those good things. And on that very final note, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Please do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all no sooner than in September, because as a reminder, next week I am flying to Glasgow and Welcon and then Ireland to spend the month of August with my partner. So yes, I will be absent for a little while there, but still, I will see you all in the next video, whenever that is, in a bit more than a month. But until then, bye-bye.